reiterate, if anyone has any technical problems, feel free to write in on the questions box, and Adam and my colleague Sally here will be monitoring the questions, both for substantive questions, which we encourage everyone to ask, and also any technical issues you're having. That's the place to address them during the webinar. Again, thank you, Adam. I'm thrilled to be here today with my colleagues Isa, Aron, and Joe Reimer. Let me briefly introduce myself, and I'll introduce Isa and Joe as well. So my name again is Bradley Solmsen. I started at the URJ this past September as the Director of Youth Engagement, and that's a new position for the URJ. And our goal is to think broadly and systematically about how we engage youth across all of our programs, across our synagogues, our Israel programs, our camp programs, and youth movement, our NIFTY programs, to think about how to connect those pieces and how to do more. What aren't we doing to engage youth that we need to do? I come from, most recently, from 11 years at Brandeis University, where I had the pleasure of working very closely with Joe. And I'm trained as a Reform rabbi, and I have a master's degree in Jewish education as well. And I've worked a ton here in the States, and I've also done a lot of work with teens and youth educators in Israel. Let me quickly introduce my colleagues. Joe Reimer is the director of the Institute for Informal Jewish Education, and he's an associate professor and former director of the Hornstein program at Brandeis University. Joe was trained at Harvard as a developmental psychologist, and he currently focuses his research on experiential Jewish learning, fortunately for us, and Jewish camping and the professional development of educators. Joe currently serves as the lead faculty member for the ELI program, the Executive Leadership Institute of the Foundation for Jewish Camp, and he's on the selection committee for the Wexner Graduate Fellowship. A little bit about Isa, and as I said before I get to Isa, I worked very closely for 11 years with Joe, and I'm very excited to be on this webinar with him now. Isa, Dr. Isa Aron is Professor of Jewish Education at HUC-JIR in LA. She holds a BA from Swarthmore and her doctorate in Philosophy of Education from the University of Chicago. She did postdoctoral work at the Center for the Study of Social Intervention at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And she teaches courses in teaching, philosophy of education, and organizational change, and is the founding director of the Ria Hirsch School of Education's Experiment in Congregational Education. And I'm also thrilled to be working very closely with Isa as the co-directors of the B'nai Mitzvah Revolution. And we're very excited to be working closely on that. I want to say a brief word about goals for this webinar. Joe, Isa, and I thought a lot about how to create an opportunity to think more together about what do we mean by youth engagement, and how might looking at camp and synagogue education help us to better understand the strengths and the opportunities and connections. How do we do a good youth engagement, and how are camp and synagogue education possible lenses to better understand youth engagement? Before we got into some of the substance that we wanted to share, we wanted to ask you two quick questions. Adam, why don't you launch the first poll? We want to get a sense from everyone on the call right now on the webinar. Two quick questions. So there's a poll, and Adam, if you need, right in front of you is a poll, and we want you to answer this question: have you attended a Jewish camp? And you can check all that apply. Have you attended a Jewish camp as a camper, as a staff member, as a visitor, or if you've never been? So please check as many that apply to the poll, and we'll be able to share with you right back instantly and get a sense of people's backgrounds in terms of experience at Jewish camp. So please go ahead and answer the poll now. And in a minute, we'll send out the results. Great. All right, go ahead, Adam, and share the results, because everyone was very adept at this. So Joe and Isa, you guys should be able to see the results of the poll as well. And just quickly, it looks like 63% of the people on the webinar were at a camp as a camper, 67% as a staff member, 42% have visited camp, and 8% have never been. So that gives us a great sense of who's on the call. Adam, launch the second question. And we want to ask you one more quick question before I turn this over to Joe. Have you attended a synagogue-based Hebrew or religious school, or something else? Did you attend the Hebrew religious school synagogue-based Hebrew religious schools. So let's see here. Okay. It's great. I'm seeing stuff as it comes in. Great. This is interesting. Yep. Give it 2 more seconds. All right, Adam, go ahead and close that so we can see so 82% said yes, and 18% said no. So that's interesting data to share, especially if we correlate that with the camp information we have. And Adam, take us back to the slides, please. And we'll go. This is me. Oh, sorry, I skipped ahead. Okay, Joe, I'm going to hand off to you, and I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about some of the strengths, Joe, as you see it, in terms of a camp Jewish education.
Thank you, Bradley, and hello to everybody. I'm someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about Jewish summer camps, and the reason that we're focusing on the strengths of a Jewish summer camp education is we want to think about the question of how can we learn from that camp experience. We know that camps are very different kinds of organizations than, let's say, synagogues are, and yet, nevertheless, I think we have a lot of lessons that we can learn from the strength of camps. So let me enumerate some of the strengths of camp education that I think might have some applicability to other settings. First, a camp is immersive. That means that when you're at camp, you're there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's powerful because it creates a kind of learning environment in which a person can really immerse him or herself in the environment. And number 2, Jewish learning is part of everyday life. Unlike in the city, where in its way we step out of everyday life in order to go to the synagogue or participate in Jewish life, at camp, it's all integrated together. Number 3, at camp, much of Jewish learning comes through the arts. The arts also permeate everyday life at camp, and it's very interesting to see how the arts and Jewish life merge at camp. Music is an excellent example of that. After all, especially at a Reform Jewish camp, music permeates the day, but there's also drama and dance and arts and crafts, all of which at camp become opportunities to learn about Jewish life. Another feature of Jewish camp, certainly the Reform Jewish camps, is that Hebrew isn't simply a language of prayer. Hebrew is all around the environment. Buildings are called by their Hebrew names. Activities are referred to by their Hebrew names. Children speak sentences in which the syntax of the sentence is in English, but important nouns within the sentence are in Hebrew. We think that's very important because it kind of normalizes Hebrew not simply as a sacred language, but as a spoken language. Very much in parallel with that, at camp, Israel isn't simply a subject or something we read about in the newspapers. Rather, Israel is represented by Israelis who are young, attractive, and most importantly, trained to be part of the life of camp. And therefore, an 8 or 9-year-old can encounter Israel through the Israeli counselor who lives in his or her bunk. So too with Shabbat. Shabbat at camp is immersive. It's weekly. It's something that comes as part of the calendar. As such, although there's certainly preparation for Shabbat, Shabbat is lived rather than simply being a feature of going to the synagogue. We think that's a very powerful way for someone to learn about Shabbat. Shabbat, in a sense, fills your day and evening and is a full experience. It's also a lot of fun. It also includes the arts. It also emphasizes Hebrew. Prayer at camp. As we all know, prayer at camp can be a very different experience than in the synagogue. not only can it be outdoors, not only can it be filled with music, but it comes on a regular daily basis. As such, it too is part of everyday life. It's not something you step out of in order to enter into. It's part of your everyday life. It also allows you to learn those prayers by heart, often through the music. So too, Jewish values are lived. The beautiful thing about camp is that you could be swimming, or playing ball, or doing your artwork, or simply hanging out with your friends in the bunk. And Jewish values can be evoked as part of that ongoing life. In sum, almost any part of Jewish life at camp is immersive. It's part of everyday life. It is not separate from everyday life, but seems to just flow. A special feature of camp is the place of the counselors. Counselors on the whole are 18 and 19-year-olds who've chosen to be at that camp, who for the most part were once campers there, and who in their own unique ways model Jewish life. We think that's important because in modeling, the most powerful models are people who are most like you. And if you're a 14 or 15-year-old and you see an 18 or 19-year-old who in some important way is living a Jewish life during the summer, then that person can be a much more powerful model for you of what's Jewishly possible than your parents or grandparent, etc. Not necessarily the case, but we really want to think hard about how camps utilize people in their late teens to be important Jewish role models. We think that's an important part of the strengths of camp life.
Great.
So,
sorry, go ahead.
No, so in total, what we're seeing here is that camp deals with many of the same areas as synagogue does, but it does so in different ways, and ways that suggest themselves with important modifications for synagogue life.
Great. Joe, we also want you to think a little bit with us about where camp might be limited in terms of Jewish education before we ask Isa to talk more about the perspective of what's going on in the synagogue. What are some, in your opinion, what are some ways in which camp might be limited in terms of the way in which it's providing Jewish education?
Yeah, camp has very important limitations, Bradley. For one thing, a very small percentage of our kids actually go there. For another thing, as everybody knows, camp only lasts a few weeks a year, and its very specialness, its immersiveness, is that it is a world apart. Being a world apart, it's not always clear that kids feel while they're at camp or after they've come home from camp that what one does at camp is doable at home. So camp is powerful, but it may be a limited model. Another limitation of camp is for kids and not for families. And since Jewish life is for the most part in America lived in a family context, a very important limitation of camp is that you're not doing it with your family. Another limitation of camp is for all that camp is great at living Judaism, at kind of just simply living it, camp is not a very powerful context for deepening your Jewish knowledge beyond the immediate environment. Yes, at some camps, URJ camps, there are certainly sichot or lessons that go on in the day, but I would doubt there are too many people who view those sichot as a real immersion in Jewish knowledge. So that's a limitation for camp. Another limitation that's been spoken about a great deal is the question of camp is so special and so powerful an environment that sometimes the alumni of camp feel I could only live a full Jewish life at camp. And therefore that in fact discourages them from trying to live as full a Jewish life as one can back in city life. And so very important questions about camp are how generalizable is it for the people who go? How can it reach out to different age groups? And of course, most importantly, how can we encourage more kids to go to camp? The question we're considering today is, are there features of camp life that we could bring back to the city that could touch the lives of both many more children, but also members of their families as well.
Great. Thank you, Joe. And I would say, and vice versa, basically, I think we're trying to think about the bridge between camp and synagogue life, and how can we help enrich synagogue life, and how can synagogue life enrich camp? And I think these are important pieces. Before we turn to you, Isa, I want to take an opportunity to get some more information from the people who are listening to us and participating in the webinar. Adam, go ahead and let's launch the next poll question to get a sense of where people are in terms of participating in this question. So where did you learn the blessing over the candles? We just want to get a sense in terms of what we're talking about today. Where did you learn the blessing over the candles? So let's get a sense. Please pick the one where you think, we could have done a select all, but it is fine. Pick the one where you think you first learned the blessing over the candles, if you remember. Okay. All right. Adam, go ahead and close it. We got a good snapshot. Let's see. Here's the answers. And Isa and Joe, again, as we're writing the book on this webinar, we can factor this data into the study we're doing. So 52% say they learned at home. Isa, this is helpful for as we turn over to you in a minute. Religious school, 36%. We don't have any day school people on the phone, it sounds like. 4% from camp. Joe, that's the data for you, and 8% say other. We'll pull those 8%. And then we have one more question for everyone. Go ahead, Adam. Here's the question. Where did you learn, this is everyone is about to head into Seder. Where did you learn the 4 questions? The same choices. Passover is coming. Think back. Where did you learn the 4 questions? Okay. 74% voted, 81%. Let's see. Get a few more people in, and then we'll close. And let me just do a quick commercial. If anyone has questions for Professor Joe Reimer, we'll take a quick break between Joe and Isa's presentation. And if anyone has questions for Joe or Isa, you can type them into your question box, and we'll pause if we have. Okay, Adam, go ahead and let's share the results here. So interestingly, Passover Seder preparation, 39% learned their 4 questions from their family at home, 57% in religious school, and 4% said other. So camp is not a locus of knowledge for Seder preparation. All right, let's go back and let's just take a look and see if we have any questions coming in for Joe before we head over to Isa. Great, okay. Isa, there's a little delay here for me in my computer. Sorry, one second. There we go.
Some questions, Bradley.
Yep. Right. So I'm going to throw this out, but I think we might come back to this at the end of the presentation. But one of the questions that comes in are more programmatically, what techniques are working to engage campers once they're back at home or synagogue? Actually, I think, Isa, your presentation is going to begin to address this, so it's a good transitional question for you. But one of the people on the webinar is asking, about specifically once someone comes back from camp, what are ways for a congregation to take advantage of that? So,
Bradley, let's bring that question back at the end. That would be important.
Yeah, I agree. So why don't you go ahead, Isa, and Sally and I are here watching questions, and we'll hold off on all the questions and let you get a chance to start. Isa, go ahead.
Okay. So one of the reasons that Joe and Bradley and I wanted to do this webinar together is that people often compare camp and school, and in that comparison, school usually comes up wanting. You know, people say, oh, camp was so powerful. It's what really made me feel Jewish. Religious school was, you could fill in the blank of all the negative things people say, although not always. But the question for our webinar is, how can each learn from the other? What can camp learn from religious school? We're not going to really talk about that so much, although we could at the end. And particularly what I'm going to focus on is what can religious school learn from camp and from other educational experiences that are more experiential. So let's just quickly talk about the strengths of congregational education so that we don't lose these. First one is it's local and year-round. We saw that in our poll. Nobody learns to say the 4 questions at camp because Passover is not celebrated at camp. That's kind of obvious. Children and their families are around the synagogue, even if, we'll talk in a minute about families attending school with their kids, but children, congregational education is potentially for children and their families. It's located in the real world, not in a bubble, and therefore real world issues can come up and be dealt with. Because religious school allows for formal teaching, I'm going to argue that we need a lot less formal teaching than we have, but sometimes it's really important to have some formal teaching, and that kind of teaching works better in a school. Synagogues represent lifelong Jewish learning because camp ends, well, when you're in a camper in your teens, and then when you're staff sometime in your 20s, you no longer come back to camp. So a synagogue deals with people from preschool all the way to old age. And finally, because a person is hopefully involved in a synagogue throughout their lives, there are a lot more people who could be mentors and have close relationships with a person. And the slide says clergy. Oh, it's in there too. Good. Other members, right? It's not just clergy. It allows for close relationships with many people in the congregation. So those are the strengths. Let's go to the next slide. So here's the big question that we asked ourselves. How can congregations incorporate more experiential learning? So in the next slide is a kind of a funny little human being diagram. So let's remind ourselves, this is just to remind us, that there are a bunch of different kinds of goals that we have for Jewish education, and knowing is only one of them. We think about school as being associated with knowing, but there are 3 other goals, categories of goals that are just as important. One is believing, another is belonging, and another is living and doing. And those 3 are what experiential learning does better, in a way, than school does. So the question on the table is, how do we bring in believing, belonging, and living and doing into a place that perhaps is too focused on knowing? So let's go to the next one. So I hope you're wondering to yourself, what are these Legos doing in this webinar? I hope somebody's been asking themselves that question. I don't know if you typed it. Here's why the Legos are here as a background to this webinar. What I'm going to try to present are the building blocks for the models that can be alternative models to the religious school. So in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about alternative models to the religious school. Right now, I'm going to present a bunch of different building blocks for these models. And these should already be familiar because Joe has talked about them, and I've mentioned them as well. So one value that we really want to maximize is the connection between Jewish learning and Jewish living. You shouldn't just be learning the 4 questions. You should also be able to ask them at your Seder. You shouldn't just be learning the Shabbat, the blessing over Shabbat candles. You should be then enacting them on Shabbat. Next one. Second one is active participation, and I guess Bradley shortened it a little bit. My phrase was active participation as a key to memorable learning. When I was growing up, I learned my math facts by memorizing. I don't know how many people on this webinar did, but many of us, flashcard after flashcard and worksheet after worksheet. Today's students, some of them anyway, are more likely to learn in a more hands-on way. They measure the length of the room with Unifex cubes, or they divide 100 paper clips into piles of 3 and 4. And the theory is that these hands-on activities help students realize that math is not just a paper and pencil thing. It's about counting and measuring the real world. Same thing in Judaism. Even more than in math, we want our students to live the subject, not just memorize the fact. So if all you're doing is memorizing the brachot for Shabbat, then you're not getting it. What we really want students to get is to experience Shabbat to be lived week after week, which is, of course, as Joe talked about, what camp does. And when students understand what those blessings mean and practice them in the context of Shabbat, they will learn it in a way that no amount of memorization can do for them. Oh, okay, so this is my slide that connects, that's where memorable moment meant. We can move on to the next one. It got split into two here. Okay, we've talked about this already. It's really important to involve the entire family. Children spend much more time with their family than they spend in religious school. They spend much more time with their family than they do at home. Whatever people are doing in terms of rebelling against their parents, it is pretty clear from research on adolescents that they care a great deal about what their parents think and do, and they're learning from their parents all the time. We want to involve the entire family, and I'll talk about a little bit how that's happening. Next, please. Not only relationships within the family, but relationships with other synagogue members. We talked about that as a potential that a synagogue can do. In a synagogue, there are all sorts of people that one can learn from and be inspired by and be connected to. Next, this fits with the next one, which is creating community. So it's not just the individuals that you can connect to, but the feeling of community. People talk about camp always as, this incredible community feeling. So I don't know about your camp that you went to, those of you who went to camp, but in my camp, we did Havdalah around the baseball diamond, and everybody was around holding candles, and you had this wonderful community feeling. But synagogues also can create community, and what we're asking ourselves today is, how can religious schools create a sense of community? So the next slide begins to show how, actually, can you go back? Because there's one slide that didn't make it into the, so thanks. So now the question is, how did all these Lego blocks get put together in different ways? And I want to say something about this because I'm going to mention particular synagogues, and I'm going to mention particular models of education. This is an area that's started maybe 25 years ago, and it keeps growing, which is very exciting. Every year there's some new models coming out. It's as though people looked at these building blocks, like the bunch of Legos that were on the screen, and figured out how to put them together in different ways. Okay, I want some community, I want some family, I want things to be meaningful. And now how can I put that together? So the first one I don't have another slide for, but really it's the oldest of these models. And in my mind, it's one of the most effective. And you could call it two different things. You could call it a family school, or you could call it a Shabbat community. And I'll talk about the differences. But I guess the family school is the bigger umbrella term. It's a term for when the entire family goes to school along with the kid. Instead of dropping off the child, the parents go as well. So the earliest of these, I believe, I don't want to be held to this, but I think the earliest was at Congregation Beth Am in Los Altos Hills, just about 25 years ago. And I think that now there are at least 30 around the country. That was last time anybody counted, which was a year and a half ago. Most of these do take place on Shabbat, so that's why we call them Shabbat communities. It's a huge benefit. Parents and kids come on Shabbat morning. Sometimes they come on Shabbat afternoon. Sometimes they alternate between Friday night and Shabbat morning. But the point is that everybody's going to synagogue together. They are praying together. The parents are learning separately. The kids are learning separately. Then they're learning together. So there are all different ways of putting this together. But this is a way to give an incredibly powerful message, which is that Jewish learning is lifelong. In fact, this is the best way to give it rather than to say it, because everybody's really doing it. And one of the interesting things about this is, well, two interesting things about it. One is that you might think that parents would be reluctant to give up their Sunday morning time where they get to drop off their kids at religious school. And in fact, many parents are. You ask people, they say, well, I might be interested in this, but this is when I get to spend time with my spouse, or this is when I get to do my laundry, or whatever, all important things when everything's really busy. People's lives are very busy. So almost all the synagogues that have Shabbat communities or family schools have an alternative. It's an alternative to the religious school, and it's somewhere about 40 to 60% is my guess. It changes again every year, but usually the alternative program has somewhere between 40 and 60% of the potential kids. But the other thing is that by getting, how do they get so many people? It's word of mouth. So when a person, a particular family or a particular parent gets involved and finds that the learning is invigorating, finds that it's such a wonderful time to and way to spend time with their family, they start telling their friends, and these schools kind of recruit for themselves. So that's Shabbat communities and family schools. Next one, please. So the model I'm going to talk about now has to do with parents and kids learning together at home. And I'm not exactly sure about the order of the slides, so I'll just mention this. So there's a program at Temple Beth Elohim of Wellesley called Beit Midrash. Beit Midrash has a number of elements, but one of its main elements is that the curriculum is a series of books for every grade. It's a program that starts in 3rd grade, I believe, and goes to 5th grade. May have changed since my latest information. But the curriculum is a series of books that first parents read to their kids, and then the kid might read to him or herself by the time he or she gets to 5th grade. And they're Jewish books teaching about history or teaching about particular values or the Torah. And the parents and kids are engaged together, and sometimes there are questions that go along with it. But really, the parents are teaching the kids in this way. Next one, please. These are all different ways that parents and kids can learn together. They can do holiday preparation. They can do it at home. They can do it at the synagogue. Next one. They can do holiday celebration together. Some programs have a lot of this. They sort of, this is part of deconstructing the religious school and putting it back together. Again, they say, okay, well, why are we celebrating Hanukkah with only the kids? We should get the parents to celebrate Hanukkah. And this one looks like it's in someone's house, not in the synagogue. And I think that's important. It sort of locates the Jewish practice in people's homes. Next. Okay, so let me just say before I get to the day camps and retreats that the Community Synagogue of Rye has an interesting program like this, and it gives parents and kids actual homework to do at home, and then they do the holiday celebration. So there's all sorts of ways that you could have parents and kids learning together at home. So then a third way of doing this, which is pretty new, well, I think it's old, like 2 decades old, and then died for a while, but now it's back, which is to make religious school really be at camp. So about 3 years ago, Temple Judea in Los Angeles created a program called Nisayon. Nisayon is the Hebrew word for experience. It centers around 2 camp times when kids go to day camp. They go to day camp for 2 weeks in June, and they go to day camp for a week during the winter break. And except for the fact that they're sleeping at home, they do all the things that you do at camp. They pray every day. They have sports. They have arts. They have everything Joe mentioned, music, Hebrew. And they also actually, in that day, have some formal learning time. So the kids are getting, let's say, 15 days of very intensive Jewish learning, maybe not quite as immersive as a sleepaway camp, but pretty immersive. Kids are very who go to this program are very satisfied. This program is taking off. The Reform movement now has a couple of projects going of trying to hook camp and religious school more closely together. Temple Micah in Washington, D.C. has a program where they involve more camp elements as well. Next one. Okay, so this is the ultimate Lego exercise that I hope some of you would do, and there are places that are doing this. Think about this as Legos and take them apart and put them together in ways that work for your religious school. Take things like reading at home and holiday celebration, and we didn't talk about Tikkun Olam projects, but we could have Tikkun Olam projects, and put them together in a way that makes sense for the families and for the individuals. At Temple Emmanuel in Beverly Hills, there was a program like this a couple of years ago called KEF, Kvutza of Emmanuel Families, that did just that. There's a project in New York that involves a bunch of synagogues, including some Reform ones. It's called the Jewish Journey Project, and the kids do projects. They work towards earning badges, and some of the badges are more experiential, and some are more formal learning. But again, the same idea. All the different parts of a religious school education, put it together in a different way. So I think I'm going to stop here.
Great. Thank you, Isa. And so now I've pulled out some questions, and Joe and Isa, this first question I'd like to ask both of you to think about. There's a perception, and this might be a reality in many places. I don't know if we have data about this, but Joe, you mentioned this, and Isa, I'd love to hear both of you talk about this a little bit. The question is this: camps in some ways succeed to the extent that I want to have this experience again. The only way I'm going to have it is to come back to camp. And I know that part of the whole point of this webinar is to begin to debunk that. But the magic of camp is that you can only have it at camp. And there's another tension in the synagogue of similar maybe resistance to what we do at the synagogue has to be this arena of programming, and we don't want to go beyond this arena of programming because it's not the synagogue type programming. When synagogues or camps come to either of you and say, well, we want to consider going beyond our walls, but there's a risk there. I'd love to hear both of you talk about what might be behind that and how you help either synagogues or camps see the bigger picture and actually see that we're all, when we're allies, I think that we can achieve more working together, but it seems like there's a natural resistance. Could I ask both of you to talk? Joe, do you mind taking a first stab at this?
Sure, I would be glad to. First of all, we could talk about camp-synagogue alliances, and I've seen those right here in the Boston area in the Reform movement, and they're very powerful. Obviously, that is helped when members of the clergy or educational faculty go to camp, and therefore they themselves represent a bridge. But even if that's not the case, I've seen synagogues that invite kids who've gone to camp to bring back with them some of the practices of camp and to enact those, often on Friday nights, but it could be at other times. I think more can be done by that, not just at services, but I think even at religious school. In addition to that, I've seen efforts around the country for synagogues and sometimes day schools to actually specifically hire people who've been at camp, staff members of camp, to come be part of the educational program in the synagogue to both bring some of the richness of camp program with them, but also to serve as a bridge. More than that, Isa has already discussed this, but we really could think through the use of day camps and the use of retreats. Are there elements of camp that the synagogue can call its own? The history of this is very rich. If you think about the history of Reform Jewish music, which Judah Cohn has written about, we have an excellent example of music that began primarily at camp, infiltrating into the sanctuary in the synagogue, and in some ways really taking that sanctuary over. And so the introduction of the guitar into the synagogue is a very powerful example, and we should think of others in which a feature of camp life actually has become very much a common feature of synagogue life. And I think there are other such opportunities.
Great. Isa, any thoughts in terms of this gap?
Well, so one thing I just want to say is that there's kind of the obvious formal learning way that camps and religious schools also ought to be cooperating. if a certain subject, if a certain thing is going to be the theme of camp, wouldn't it make sense for the religious school to pick up the theme? This sometimes happens informally. I mean, in some NIFTY camps or URJ camps, a lot of the faculty are educators at synagogues or rabbis at synagogues, but as far as I know, nobody really formalizes this. So wouldn't it be a radical idea if actually people got together and planned curriculum together? I mean, what a great idea. So that's maybe, and then will somebody, not me because I don't know enough about it, say something about Nadiv? It's really important to talk about this.
I'm happy to say something. Nadiv is a program that has been supported by the Avichai Foundation. And the Avichai Foundation has done something that we're doing today. It has asked, how do we leverage the strength of city institutions with camp institutions? And so, for example, with the URJ Camp Kalsman in Washington State, there's a place where a fellow, that is to say, a person is designated as having an educational role in a central synagogue and in camp, and he or she is designated and is paid extra money to do the kind of bridging that Isa was just talking about. It could be curricular, it could be resource, it could be arts and crafts, but the person sees him or herself as the embodiment of that bridge. And Avichai has sponsored that fellowship precisely to ask the questions we're asking here. Why do these two great institutions need to operate so separately from each other when clearly they have so much to offer one another?
I know, Joe, just to add that I believe that Crane Lake and what's the name, Isa, of the synagogue in Manhattan?
Shari Tefillah in New York.
Shari Tefillah in New York City and Crane Lake are also sharing a professional. And it's a model that I think has a lot of promise, and it concretizes the theoretical point that I think we're all making in this webinar, that these are two major institutions in the lives of our youth, and if the professionals, if we can take professionals and occupy them 12 months of the year, going back and forth from these two, I think it begins to allow for what Isa was just talking about, right? If there's a theme at camp, can that theme come into the religious school or the congregation in some way, and vice versa? And I think Isa, it's a great idea to bring up Nadiv, and it's a small program, but I think one that has a lot of potential. And I'll just add that there are some communities that are doing the same thing with Israeli emissaries, with young shlichim who are coming from Israel to spend the summer at camp and then staying in the community, one of the communities connected to that camp. And if there are people on the webinar, there may be people on the webinar who are living in a community such as this, but more importantly, if you're not, it's another option to think about. And that brings in a whole third component, which is sort of strengthening connection to Israel, strengthening connection to camp, and strengthening the community all at the same time. So there are some structural ways that people can really think about this. I want to ask another question, Isa and Joe. This is an interesting question that goes beyond, but I think you mentioned this early on in your talk, Joe. But one of the people on the webinar have asked us about once you're leaving high school and going off to college, there are so many pulls on the time and attention of our students these days. In thinking about what we've spoken about today in the webinar, can either one of you or both of you address this issue of how do you catch either older high school students or college students in this arena? What have you guys seen as successful strategies or thinking in terms of older kids, not necessarily the campers and the younger students?
What I have seen, is Joe again, what I have seen is something really, I think, really quite promising. Everybody knows that most synagogues have what they call a madrich program, where they utilize teenagers as some part of the religious school. But that program is really, I think, highly underdeveloped because often those teens are just simply office help or minor help. What I've seen here in the Boston area, some synagogues have actually, obviously in Boston it's a little easier because we have a lot of universities, have really capitalized on hiring college students who also are camp counselors in the URJ camps, and really, in a sense, looking out for them and recruiting them and training them and helping them to think of themselves as emissaries of that camp in a very practical sense. And I don't think we've done nearly enough to ask ourselves, our counselors at camp are such a valued resource, and we really, in some sense, haven't fully utilized their strengths during the year. And I think there's an avenue for exploration, especially in places where synagogues are near universities. Who keeps the lists of which URJ counselors are at which universities, and who thinks systematically about the ways in which we can make those people shlichim also, emissaries as well, from the camp world to the synagogue world. I think there's a lot of potential there.
Right, and I'll just add that here's where a little bit of money goes a long way. What every older high school student and college student needs is some extra money, and why not work in a synagogue or do some kind of Jewish education work instead of working in the library or the dining hall or whatever?
Great. Great. It's also an area, the URJ, and both of you referenced this briefly, but I want to say that the URJ is thinking very seriously and carefully about the potential to expand what we do in terms of day camps. We're not ready to make an announcement about which way we're going to go, but we do realize for everything that both of you just said that, first of all, there's a population of young little kids who could benefit from day camp, but the people who staff day camp are exactly this population, and there's I think a tremendous potential there as well.
Yeah, there's a camp in California that is not part of the URJ, but that has developed a really interesting program where they offer those teenagers who are not going to Israel for the designated Israel summer day camp experience. One could begin to think about day camps, which I think are another underutilized resource, as a training ground both for future camp counselors, but also for lots of other of the experiential modes of education that Isa has been talking about. So I think day camps have great potential here.
Let me ask you guys another question that's come in, and it has to do with the immersive nature of camp and how, Isa, you spoke about this, that without saying, I think, immersive, but I think one of the struggles when you get back to the other 10 months of the year, how do you capture that immersive quality? Do you have to do immersive activities, or are there other ways around it? You mentioned retreats, Isa, which I think has tremendous potential for congregations to think about utilizing retreats as a possibility. But one of the questions is, when you have fewer contact hours, is the only way, I mean, you talked about a bunch of different things, but how do you capture some of the strength of the immersive experience when you don't have the immersive time?
So I think that some of this is about memorable moments, and maybe the slide went by a little too quickly. But I'm thinking of a school, I think it's Temple Sinai, I just know if it's called Temple in Connecticut, that has this really interesting program called Explorations. And it's a program that is completely staffed by members of the congregation. I mean, I think there are educators at the top, at the head of it, but then all the rest are volunteer members of the congregation. And they cycle in and out for, I don't know, 6-week units or something. And the staff, for a period of 6 weeks, they go by different themes. And let's say the theme is Genesis or something like that. The team, which are adults in the congregation, studies Genesis together, and then their job is to think about ways to put the ideas across in very memorable ways. So you don't see any teaching of Genesis there. What you see are plays and improvisation and art projects and all the kinds of things that could go on in camp that are used on Sunday mornings with these parents. Now, I haven't been there, but people who've been there say it's really pretty impressive, the kind of passion that it arouses because of these memorable moments. It's different from camp, but still can be very powerful.
Great. Great. Another question that people are thinking about, I know, and I know, just to be clear to everyone on the webinar, Joe and Isa have tons of experience, both of them, in thinking about these questions of helping the congregational school, helping the synagogue, helping the congregation think about youth engagement broadly. I'd love to hear both of you talk about if a congregation wants to make a shift, is it all or nothing? How do you bring in some more of these experiential methodologies and this kind of philosophy without sort of subdividing the community? What's worked in terms of how you incorporate this kind of change? What are strategies for adopting change in the congregation so that there's more likelihood that a congregation will be successful in terms of sticking a toe in the water or trying some of these things?
Okay, so I'm so glad that you asked that because I saw this question and I was hoping that you would pick this one. I want to mention Temple Shalom in Scotch Plains, New Jersey, which is a small congregation, not even really a medium-sized congregation. And they became convinced that they wanted to do a family school, but they didn't want to completely divide their congregation. And they did something that I thought was pretty ingenious. They divided their school into trimesters, and eventually, in the beginning, they made it voluntary, but after a while, it became required. But in the beginning, it was like voluntary that you could go with your family to one of these trimesters. In other words, they created it so that it was all parallel, and for 3 months, or I guess it's not exactly 3 months, 2.5 months of the school year, the family would go together. And if they wanted, they could go all 3 times, but they didn't have to. And eventually, they started to require it for 1 out of the 3. That took care of the kids who played soccer and the kids who played baseball and the parents who whatever. And they managed to do it. And you know, sometimes people just can't work it into their whole lives, but they can work it into part of their lives. I think that's a really ingenious way to manage this problem.
What we've tried in the Boston area, here we have tremendous advantages of having resources from our federation, is the federation has brought together teams of congregations, mostly Reformed, but also some conservative, who have lay people and professionals thought together about changing models of education. And what really stands out for me about that is they think holistically. They start with the parents who are congregants, and they think about how would these parents want to extend the best of the synagogue to their children. And what about this congregation really is something we want to highlight for our children. And then they help each other discover what the strength of that particular congregation is and how to represent those strengths educationally to the children. And almost inevitably, that involves a greater degree of what Isa has been talking about in terms of experiential Jewish education.
And I'm glad you said something. I just want to add one more thing here. It almost always costs more money. So let's just say it and not be ashamed about it. If you want quality education, you're going to have to spend more money. So even this small congregation in New Jersey had to hire a second educator to do some of this rich experiential family-based learning on top of the regular religious school. So I don't think you can get anything for nothing. So it almost costs, almost always costs more, except for exploration, which does it all on volunteers.
Yeah, we're working hard here at the URJ to take that very seriously, meaning to raise more funds, but also to think about alternative models like thinking about all the resources that every congregation has in terms of just adults, lay leaders. You said this, both of you. The strength of the congregation, and it's a strength of camp too, right? At camp, the kids at camp develop tremendous relationships with counselors because they're living with them. And those counselors are not their parents, and they're not their teachers. And in the congregation, I believe, and we want to pilot some test programs, and we have one that will start in Texas this fall. Through Green Family Camp, we want to find lay leaders in congregations who are interested in being mentors. And with those lay leaders need to be trained, and there needs to be an application process. And Isa, we take seriously, and Joe, everything that you've said. But we're wondering whether there might be a possibility of, in addition to strong professionals, we have to have strong professionals in our synagogue, but we also have, I think, an untapped cadre of lay leaders who would be interested in mentoring and coaching and being a part of, whether it's like a Big Brother program for children or high school students, or some version of that. We think there's some possibility in that kind of experiment. We're nearing our 60 minutes of the webinar. I want to pause here and just thank you both, Isa and Joe, for sharing your thoughts, answering questions, and really, I think, challenging us to think more about these tremendous opportunities that we have and the strength of linking them more and thinking about how we could benefit the movement and Judaism and the Jewish community as a whole by thinking about how these two pieces connect to better youth engagement. So Isa and Joe, thank you very much. I want to thank Sally and Adam in the background for making this work, and I want to thank everyone who participated in listening or writing in questions. And I have my email address up on this final slide. We're here at the URJ if you want to write in or have other ideas or ask other questions to talk more about youth engagement. And again, Isa, Joe, thank you so much, and we really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll be signing off now.